Okay, so just a little brief recap. We're talking about Ham, Shem, and Japheth yesterday, how they repopulated the earth with their descendants, right? Now, in the listing of the individuals in Genesis 10, we trace the tribal groups that came after Noah, right? 70 descendants of Noah's sons are listed. This list is not exhaustive, but provides general information on how these groups later developed into peoples. God's grace offered to Adam and Eve in the garden and offered again later to Noah. It was extended to each of these. Some responded, some did not. Now, just a recap of the three different groups of descendants. The descendants of Japheth became the Indo-European people who settled east into parts of Asia, north into Europe, and westward to Spain. The descendants of Ham moved to what we know today as North Africa and the Far East. The descendants of Canaan, which is, remember, one of the sons of Ham, settled in the area that God later promised to give to the descendants of Shem. And finally, the descendants of Shem, Noah's firstborn son, became Hebrews and Syrians. The line of faith to God came through Shem and his descendants, while the descendants of Japheth and Ham were traced only through 6 generations. Those of Shem are traced through 10. 10. Now, Moses, the writer of Genesis, interrupts the table of nations to give us a portrait of Nimrod. That's in Genesis 10, chapter 8. Genesis chapter 10, verse 8 through 12. He talks about Nimrod as a mighty hunter before the Lord, verse 9, and a builder of cities, whose name became a proverb to the following generations. Now, Nimrod exerted leadership and recruited men to build cities, Babylon and 3 others in the fertile plains of Shinar and Nineveh, and other cities in Assyria, by the way. Now, what motivated this guy Nimrod? Well, he's been described as a hunter or a tyrant who hunted and conquered men, not animals, in his ambition to build an empire that would challenge God's right to rule over his creation. More on this as we look at the chapter 11 in a little bit. God was not blind to what Nimrod was doing as he attempted to build a kingdom that would rival God's. God knows the hidden ambition of those who oppose him. Excuse me. Now, Cush, as Ham's oldest son, had apparently resented this curse more and more as the years passed by. By the time Nimrod was born, the resentment had become so strong that he gave his son a name, meaning, let us rebel. The inference is that Cush trained Nimrod from childhood to be a leader in a planned and organized rebellion against God's purpose for mankind. Now, so we're going to read about the Tower of Babel. Now, after the flood, God had commanded people to spread out and fill up the earth. That's in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, remember? Nimrod, in his obsession to build his own empire, came up with a plan. With enormous self-confidence and pride, he settled in the plain of Shinar, which is known as Babylonia, and laid out his plans to build a city with a tower that would be used in a form of worship. Now, his main objective, we're going to read, for himself and his followers was very audacious in its 2 purposes. 1, to make a name for himself, and 2, to disobey God's command that they be scattered over the face of the whole earth. A couple of notes here before I start here. Their tower would reach up towards the heavens and challenge the living God, the creator of heaven and earth. They rebelled against God without any effort to conceal their motives. Now, the Bible states that tar, or something known as bitumen, was used in the construction of the tower. Since this material is almost unknown in Israel, it's mentioned in the Bible accounts verifies its accuracy. Now, let's start reading that. All right, so let's see here. Let me see my other little notebook here. Just want to make sure I don't miss anything, especially out of context, you know. Okay, so here we go. We're going to read a few paragraphs here. At one time, all the people of the world spoke the same language and used the same words. As the people migrated to the east, they found a plain in the land of Babylonia. Also, in Hebrew is Shinar, but it's Babylonia, and settled there. They began saying to each other, "Let's make bricks and harden them with fire." In this region, bricks were used instead of stone, and tar was used for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let's build a great city for ourselves with a tower that reaches into the sky. This will make us famous and keep us from being scattered all over the world." Now, God had told the people to spread out and populate the world, remember? But they wanted to do just the opposite. They wanted to get together and make like a super state, if you will, led by the first world dictator Nimrod, who we just heard about, whose name means "we will rebel." They tried to put together a godless confederacy on the plain of Shinar. They built a tower, which was supposed to be a gateway to God, or a tower to heaven. Now, here's a couple of things. The name, Bab El, very important. Remember, El means the name of God, and Bab means gateway. So this would basically be Bab El, gateway to God. Now, more on this title a little later, because they also try to mix the Babel. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But technically, it's Bab El, which is gateway to God. El is God. These ancient people were probably far brighter than we think. They were not trying to climb to heaven by a ladder. This was an astrological temple on 7 levels high. This is where the original zodiac became corrupted. The whole thing was a pagan rebellion against the living God. Now, at that time, the scriptures say there was one language, which that people believe it was Hebrew, a Semitic language. So God confused their language, forcing them to disband. This is the beginning of Babylon, which also became a major power center in later history. Now, little interesting thing. The history of the Bible can be viewed as a tale of two cities, if you will. Babylon is the city of man. Jerusalem is the city of God. Both of them have their beginnings in Genesis, and both of them are prominent in the climax of the book of Revelation. They actually represent ideas, not just locales. The Bible focuses on three primary purposes. Okay? God's covenant with Abraham, which will be taken up in the next section. Then his seed of all the nations will be blessed. God's covenant with the nation Israel, that if they faithfully serve him, they prosper, and if they forsook him, they will be destroyed. God's covenant with David, that his family would produce the Messiah who would reign over God's people forever. Okay, so let's also a couple of notes. We talked about some names yesterday, and I try to tell you a little bit of context where they eventually derive to, right? But the people descended from Ham's 4 sons. Remember, Ham is the one that his son Canaan was cursed, right? But technically, check this out. Ham's 4 sons turned out to be the Egyptians, Babylonians, Assyrians, and Canaanites. They were Israel's most hostile neighbors for a long time. Many critics have often admitted that the 10th chapter of Genesis is primarily, very, very remarkably accurate historically and in every other way. It's a very accurate historical document. Now, it is probable, remember there's only men mentioned, right? That besides all these men, there were also a large number of women who were not mentioned, but I'm sure there were. So let's continue here. Oh, yeah, we talk about bricks instead of stones, right? In Mesopotamia, stone was scarce, so brick making was developed. Tar was made from bitumen, which is a natural cement-like waterproof asphalt, if you will. Let's continue. Then they said, "Come, let's build a great city for ourselves with a tower that reaches into the sky. This will make us famous and keep us from being scattered all over the world." But the Lord came down to look at the city and the tower the people were building. "Look," he said, "the people are united, and they all speak the same language. After this, nothing they set out to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us, here's that word again, let's go down and confuse the people with different languages. Then they will not be able to understand each other. In that way, the Lord scattered them all over the world, and they stopped building the city. That is why the city was called Babel, because it is where the Lord confused the people with different languages. In this way, he scattered them all over the world. Now, I want to show you something here. Babel sounds like a Hebrew word that means confusion also. But there's like I said, there's a different term also. If you dissect the word Bab and then El, it also means gateway to God. That's what I wanted to show you earlier. That has a couple of different meanings there. So, a couple of things here. Let us, right? A couple of explanations, or it could be a combination of both. The Godhead, which is a Trinity, right, mentioned in chapter 1, verse 26, chapter 3, verse 22, or some of his holy angels, maybe even both, right, which is good. Let me see, any other, want to make sure I don't miss anything out here. Yes. Let me see. I think I have something else to share with you guys here. Like I said, I have notes in different places here. Okay. I think we're good right there. Let me see anything over here. Yeah, I have some other notes. There's a little more historical notes from a different history book. But let me share this with you. As each family and tribal unit migrated away from Babel, not only did they develop a distinctive culture, but they also each developed distinctive physical and biological characteristics. Since they could communicate only with members of their own family unit, there was no further possibility of marrying outside the family. So, it was necessary to establish new families composed of very close relatives, for several generations at least. It is well established genetically that variations take place very quickly in a small inbreeding population, but only very slowly in a large interbreeding population. In the latter, only the dominant genes will find common expression in the outward physical characteristics of the population, reflecting more or less average characteristics, even though the genetic factors for specific distinctive characteristics are latent or suppressed, if you will, in the gene pool of the population. Now, in a small population, however, the particular suite of genes that may be present in its members, though excessive or recessive in a large population, will have opportunity to become openly expressed and even dominant under these circumstances. In other words, in a very few generations of such inbreeding, distinctive characteristics of skin color, height, hair texture, facial features, temperament, environmental adjustment, and others could come to be associated with particular tribes or nations. That's what people started eventually changing to Asians and dark people and light people and so forth and so forth. That's what it means right there. Interesting, though. Interesting. Let me see. Anything else I want to share from here? Nah. Okay, good. Just want to make sure. Okay, let's continue now. The line of descent from Shem to Abram. This is the account of Shem's family. 2 years after the great flood, when Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arphaxad. After the birth of Arphaxad, Shem There you go. Shem lived another 500 years and had other sons and daughters. When Arphaxad was 35 years old, he became the father of Shelah. After the birth of Shelah, Arphaxad lived another 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Shelah was 30 years old, he became the father of Eber. After the birth of Eber, Shelah lived another 403 years and had other sons and daughters. When Eber was 34 years old, he became the father of Peleg. After the birth of Peleg, Eber lived another 430 years and had other sons and daughters. When Peleg was 30 years old, he became the father of Reu. After the birth of Reu, Peleg lived another 209 years and had other sons and daughters. When Reu was 32 years old, he became the father of Serug. After the birth of Serug, Reu lived another 207 years and had other sons and daughters. Now we're getting closer to Abraham here. When Serug was 30 years old, he became the father of Nahor. After the birth of Nahor, Serug lived another 200 years and had other sons and daughters. When Nahor was 29 years old, he became the father of Terah. After the birth of Terah, Nahor lived another 119 years and had other sons and daughters. After Terah was 70 years old, he became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. So far, so good right there. Let me see. 11:10. Make sure I don't miss anything. Okay. Now, I want to spotlight on the name Terah. Terah was the father of Abram, or otherwise later known as Abraham. Terah, okay? God directs our attention to one particular family, Terah, a descendant of Shem. Now, he's the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Abram's wife was Sarai, and Haran's son was Lot. We now have been introduced to characters who will play key roles from Genesis chapter 12 to 24, as God works out his incredible plan of redemption. Now, the first scene is set in Ur, right here, okay? It's a city that evidenced characteristics of an advanced, ungodly civilization. Now, God is sovereign. He works out his plans even while nations have ruled him out and are carrying their own plans. All right. I have some details about this town, Ur, because very little is told here, right? Very little. But Ur, okay, details of this city were known from more than 100,000 clay tablets written in Sumerian and Semitic Babylonian dialects. Population was actually 250,000 people in those days. There was a lot of commerce and manufacturing at that time, a lot of it. Just want to let you guys know, it was a very, very big city. In other words, and very, very ungodly. They worshiped a lot of different gods, and it wasn't a very, very good place. So that's why Abraham's family decided to move away from there after they got the message from God. Let's talk about that real quick. This is the account of Terah's family. Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot. But Haran passed away in Ur of the Chaldeans, the land of his birth, while his father Terah was still living. Meanwhile, Abram and Nahor both married. Okay, the name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. Milcah and her sister Iscah were daughters of Nahor's brother Haran. But Sarai was unable to become pregnant and had no children. One day, Terah took his son Abram, his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and his grandson Lot, his son Haran's child, and moved away from Ur of the Chaldeans. He was headed for the land of Canaan, but they stopped at Haran and settled there. Terah lived for 205 years and passed away while still in Haran. Now, this right here, it was a fresh start in the book of Genesis. Now, 3 times already, God's judgment had fallen. First, humanity was banished from the garden. Remember, chapter 3, verse 23 and 24? Second, humanity was destroyed by the flood, chapters 6 through 9. And 3, humanity was divided by diverse languages. Now, there's also 5 primal curses. So far, 3 judgments and 5 curses. What are the curses? Number 1, the serpent was cursed. Chapter 3, verse 14 and 15. Then in chapter 3, verse 17, the ground was cursed. Then in chapter 4, verse 11 and 12, Cain was condemned. Then in chapter 9, verse 25 to 27, Canaan was going to go to servitude. And then in chapter 11, language distinctions caused misunderstandings among the nations. Okay? So I wanted to show you something here now. Talk a little bit about Abraham. I'm going to show the baby. We're going to read out of the baby right now. Let's see, page 48 and 49. The baby is my favorite Bible. It's a beautiful little, I call it an article, if you will. An article. Information about Abraham, in other words, right? Okay, let's let me put this right here. I don't want to lose my place and my notes here, so I'm gonna put a little marker here. Here we go. Okay, I gotta read this too. This is interesting. Abraham, friend of God. By faith, Abraham obeyed when God called him to leave home and go to another land. He went without knowing where he was going. By faith, Abraham offered Isaac as a sacrifice when God was testing him. That was from Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8 and verse 17. Abraham's life illustrates the faithful obedience for which he is best known for. God called Abram from the city of Ur to become the patriarch of God's people. Abram's family relationship are recorded in Genesis 11, verse 26 through 32. Terah had 3 sons, Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Terah left Ur with Abram, Abram's wife Sarai, and Lot, whose father Haran had passed away on his way to Canaan. Terah settled in the land of Haran, in the city of Haran. God had called Abram to a new land while he was still in Ur. God told Abraham, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. God blessed Abram by making a covenant with him that included promises of great blessing, numerous descendants, and a new land. Chapter 12, verse 1 through 3. These promises later saved Israel from destruction when they repeatedly failed to keep their covenant with God. Leviticus 26, verse 40 through 45. Abram left Haran at age 75, entering Canaan. He went first to Shechem, a Canaanite city between Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. God appeared to Abram near the oak of Moreh, a Canaanite shrine. Abram built altars there and near Bethel, proclaiming the one true God of these centers of false worship. Abram later moved to Hebron by the oaks of Mamre, again building an altar to worship God. When God again promised blessings to Abram in a vision, Abram exclaimed that he is still childless because Sarai was barren, and that Eleazar of Damascus was his heir. That was his servant, his main servant. This obscure statement is clarified by the Nuzi documents. According to Hurrian customs, a childless couple of means could adopt an heir, often a slave who will be responsible for their burial and mourning. However, a natural son born after the slave heir's adoption would supplant him. Apparently, Abram had adopted Eleazar in this manner, but God promised that Abram's own son will be his heir. Chapter 15, verse 4. We'll get to that soon. Now, the hallmark of Abram's life was that he believed the Lord, and that the Lord considered him righteous because of his faith. Chapter 15, verse 6, in Romans chapter 4, Galatians chapter 3, and James chapter 2. Abram was declared righteous not because he was sinless. On several occasions, he failed to do what was right. Twice, he lied about Sarai out of fear, and he took the provisions of a son into his own hands with Hagar, rather than continuing to wait for God to act. but he consistently returned to faith as a fundamental principle of his life before God. Abram was 86 years old when Ishmael was born to Sarai's servant Hagar. When Abram was 99, the Lord appeared to him and reaffirmed his covenant, promising of a son and a blessing. Chapter 17. Adding circumcision as a mark of the covenant relationship. God also changed Abram and Sarai's name to Abraham and Sarah. Abraham laughed at the promise of another son. Shortly thereafter, the Lord appeared again to Abraham, chapter 18, and again announced the promised son. This time, Sarah was caught laughing in disbelief. Chapter 18, verse 12 through 15. Abraham was 100 years old and his wife 90 when the Lord did exactly what he had promised. The long-promised son who was born and was fittingly named Isaac, which means he laughs. The supreme test of Abram's faith came when God commanded him to sacrifice Isaac. Abraham obeyed faithfully, trusting that God would not thwart his own purposes. Just as the knife was about to fall, the angel of God stopped Abraham and provided a ram for him to sacrifice in Isaac's place. Abraham's faith was complete. Christians understand the sacrifice of Isaac as prefiguring God's provision of his only son, Jesus Christ, as a sacrifice for the sins of the world. God had fulfilled his covenant with Abraham through Jesus Christ, through whom the blessing of salvation is extended to all who have faith. Romans chapter 4, verse 16 and 17. And believers became Abraham's spiritual descendants, Galatians chapter 3. Abraham's life shows that God is faithful and worthy of belief and obedience. The full import of God's promise was realized when the gospel was preached to all nations and people from all families of the earth responded in faith. Galatians chapter 3. Abraham was God's friend, 2 Chronicles chapter 20 and James chapter 2. All who live by faith are challenged to live as he did, daily venturing into the unknown with trust in God's guidance and sustenance. Abraham is one of the many great witnesses to a life of faith, inspiring believers to persevere in faith because we know God is faithful. Just a little bit of background information there about Abraham. All right, let's continue here. Now, verse 1. Can you guys see this? Yes. Okay, good. The call of Abram. The Lord has said to Abram, leave your native country, your relatives, and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. Now, Abram knew that he should leave, right? But he did not know where he was going. This requires obedience which required faith. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you. All the families. What does that mean? The whole world, not just the Jews. Very, very important. Very important. Let me see here. I want to share something with you now. So far, what we covered there, God has created people for his own pleasure, right? And for their blessing on earth and throughout eternity. But the first people chose to disobey him, Adam and Eve and stuff, and brought sin into the world. When sin increased through each generation, God sent judgment through the flood, saving only Noah and his family. So far, so good, right? When sin increased and people turned from God, he reached out in grace to one man, Abram, who heard his call and responded in faith and obedience. God was not through with the human race. Reaching out to Abram was another new beginning. Abram's story vibrates with the truth that one person can make a difference when that person responds to God's call with trust and obedience. I keep repeating that. It requires faith, trust, obedience. Through Abram, God founded a new nation that would receive his special blessing. Now, through that nation, the Savior of the world would be born. Now, three times in Scripture, Abram is called God's friend. I'll even tell you the scriptures. 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verse 7, Isaiah 41, verse 8, and James chapter 2, verse 23. He was called God's friend. It was a distinction not given any other character in the Bible. While it is true that Abram had faults and fell short of God's standards, he had faith. And over many years of testing, he continued to trust God. Now, a little bit of back and forth here. In the 400 years after the flood, the descendants of Noah multiplied and spread out, right? In the fertile plains of Babylon, a civilization flourished in every way except in its acknowledgement of a true God. In the progressive city of Ur, God searched out one man and spoke to him. We're talking about Abram, of course. Now, a couple of things here. The stream of daily life flowed on, right? The human race had chosen to go its own way and was living without regard for the God who had created them. Then God stepped in. He interrupted the normal routine of Abram's life with a startling call. Abram was to leave his country, the large community from which he was a part of, and his father's household. The call was to Abram from the God of heaven and earth. God gave promises that must have filled him with amazement and a deep sense of awe. 6 promises. First one, I will make you a great nation. Genesis chapter 12, verse 2. I will bless you. Verse 2. Also, I will make your name great. That's also in verse 2. You shall be a blessing as well. In verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. That's in verse 3. These promises were not for Abram only, but for the nations that would come from him, and then actually ultimately for all the people on the earth. Abram was faced with a choice. He could ignore the voice and continue life in Ur, or he could respond to the voice with trusting obedience. No matter which he chose, life could never be the same for him. Amen. Let's go to verse 4. So Abram departed as the Lord had instructed, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, and all his wealth, his livestock, and all the people he had taken into his household at Haran, and headed for the land of Canaan. When they arrived in Canaan, Abram traveled through the land as far as Shechem. There he set up a camp beside the oak of Moreh. At that time the area was inhabited by Canaanites. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your descendants. And Abram built an altar there and dedicated it to the Lord, who had appeared to him. After that, Abram traveled south and set up camp in the hill country with Bethel to the west and Ai to the east. There he built another altar and dedicated it to the Lord. And he worshipped the Lord. Then Abram continued traveling south by stages towards the Negev. Now, just a couple of notes here. God called and Abram responded. That's beautiful. Now, though he could see nothing that would encourage him to obey God, he trusted and stepped out into the unknown. Now, looking at Abram, one would not judge him to be a likely candidate to receive God's great promises. Abram came from a family of idol worshippers. He was 75 years old when he left Haran. Hardly the typical age for making a major life change, if you think about it. As he pursued his journey, some of his relatives appeared to lose heart in the expedition and settled down before reaching the destination. We read about that. We just read about that a few verses ago. God had chosen, and though God had promised to make a nation of Abram, Abram had no son. Sarai had been unable to bear children. Now, it would seem that God's new beginning was off to a rough start. And technically it was. 25 years later, they will have the kid. 25 years of waiting and having faith, except for one all-important factor. Abram believed God. He had faith and was willing to obey even though he had no idea God was directing him. That is a very, very wonderful way to think about that. After Terah passed away in Haran, God spoke to Abram and gave him promises. Abram left with Sarai and Lot and traveled to the land of Canaan. Arriving at Shechem, he received yet another promise from God. To your descendants I will give this land. Abram responded by building an altar to the Lord. From Shechem he moved to Bethel and pitched his tent between Bethel and Ai. There he built another altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord before moving on towards the Negev. Negev is the southern part of Canaan. Southern part of Canaan. Okay, I think right now we're going to pause right here and continue tomorrow at this point.